Okay, so let's take a look at the results of Wright's experiment. Remember, we had three conditions in the experiment: the open condition, tokenism, and the closed. In the open condition, everybody theoretically could have achieved entrance into the high status group, but they just didn't score high enough on the decision-making task. Of course, that was all rigged. They were assigned into that group. In the tokenism condition, they were told that they had scored well enough to make it into the high status group, but that the high status group was only accepting 2% of the candidates. And in the closed condition, all of them had scored high enough to gain entry into the high status group, but that they were denied because they didn't have the proper faculty of study. Okay, now, so the y-axis is the frequency of selection, and remember we have those 5 types of behaviors. We have acceptance, so inaction, acceptance of the system, individual normative, non-normative, collective normative, non-normative, and they're in order here. So in the open condition, where they just didn't score well enough, notice what you have: a lot of acceptance and more endorsement of individual normative behaviors or actions. So, right, people are saying, oh, well, I didn't score well enough, well, I'll do better next time, right, that type of thing. Low levels of endorsement for collective action, right? They were told that they could have gain entrance into the high status group, but their scores just weren't high enough. And so that seems to be leading to the view that people judge the system to be legitimate, fair, and that they just need to work harder. Let's look at the closed system here. In the closed condition, remember, everybody scored well enough, but they were all denied, and you see high endorsement of collective non-normative response, right? So they're going to gang up and just challenge the system in a non-normative way. So clearly a perception of injustice here. What's interesting is the tokenism, the condition where only 2% of them were allowed entrance into the high status group, even though all of them had scores high enough to get them there. You see the spike in the endorsement for individual non-normative behavior. Individual non-normative. What's interesting is that there's still low endorsement for collective action, either normative or non-normative. And so tokenism here is setting up a situation where people are having a certain perception about the legitimacy and fairness of the entire system. And so researchers sort of saw this as a puzzle. Even when subjects were told that access to the high status group was severely restricted, and so presumably unjust, right? After all, you're only going to accept 2% of people who otherwise would qualify. Very little endorsement for collective action, and so little chance for addressing group injustice. And so that raises a question: why the individual non-normative behavior, in addition to why so little endorsement for collective? So why non-normative behavior? Wouldn't there be a danger of retaliation? So Wright and his colleagues went on to gather more evidence. Remember, they also asked people to judge the fairness of the system. And so here's what they found. In the open condition, this was judged to be the least unjust, or the most fair. The token condition, moderate unjust, or moderate fairness. Closed condition, the most unjust, right? The most unfair. Now, what is tokenism doing then? So Wright hypothesizes that what's happening with tokenism is that the boundary between these groups, the low status and high status, is ambiguous with tokenism. So you see one member of the disadvantaged group make it. That creates an ambiguity in the perception of others in the group. Okay, so on the one hand, the fact that the token makes it, that leads to the conclusion that, well, it's an open system, right? If only I try harder, I can make it too. So that's kind of supports the idea that the system's okay, the system's fair, the system's legitimate. On the other hand, if you look at the remaining members who haven't made it, who were denied entry, remember only 2% were allowed into the high status group. Well, that leads to the perception and the conclusion that no, this is kind of a closed context, right? It is the access is denied in an unjust way. So tokenism creates an ambiguity of perception. The successive fraction of individuals from your group gives you the perception that it's really an open context, the system might be fair. The perception that many of your group members remain behind leads to the conclusion that it's a bit unfair. Now, Wright suspects that what's happening here is that there's uncertainty then about the legitimacy of the system. And when there's uncertainty, this ambiguity, right, then that leads to uncertainty about support for collective action, right? So if you yourself, as you're looking at this system, you're uncertain about whether the system is fair, well, it leads to uncertainty whether others are going to join with you for collective action, right? And that leads to uncertainty about the group changing its status, right? So the individuals here are just sort of each individually uncertain about the legitimacy of the system, and consequently they kind of say of each other, well, they probably have the same kind of uncertainty, and that overall leads to reduced collective action. Now, what if an in-group member labels the context discrimination and shows anger, right? So the situation here would be that in the tokenism condition, suppose the tokens are accepted into the higher status group, but then some other individual of the group, the remaining group, says that's not fair, that's discrimination, and then they show anger. Will that affect the perceptions of the other group mates? The result was that the level of perceived collective injustice increased, right? So the low status has to be perceived as illegitimate and challengeable for collective action to result. Right? The tokens create ambiguity and so reduce collective action. Okay, here's the data for those experiments. So remember now here we have the salience of the collective injustice. So in one condition, it's a tokenism condition, but nobody complains about discrimination, or there's no anger, and we get a result very similar to the original result. If we compare the token condition here to the token condition here, it's very similar. High endorsement for individual non-normative, but relatively low endorsement for collective action. That's what we get, a replication of that. But now, when one of the members of the group that was denied entrance it shows anger and accuses the high status members of discrimination, right? Then you get higher endorsement for collective action, both normative and non-normative, right? So when the salience of the injustice is increased by people speaking up, showing anger, making accusations of discrimination, that leads to greater endorsement of collective action. And if we go back to this slide, remember, so here's the person making a judgment here. The token gains access to the high status group. But you see, when nobody says anything, there's uncertainty about how others perceive the situation, and so you get low collective active. But if one of these individuals makes it well known that discrimination is happening and they are angry, well, then that changes the perception of the rest of the members of the group. Now they see that collective action is more possible, and change is something that is possible. So it removes some of the uncertainty about the willingness of other group members to bond together and to try to work for changing the system. Now back to the question of why individual, in the response to the tokenism, why was there endorsement for individual non-normative, right? And so here Wright argues that the tokenism is having the effect of reducing the concern for the status, for group status differences. In other words, seeing somebody from your own group succeed causes the individual in the disadvantaged group to focus on intra-group comparisons, right? So focus on comparing you with other members rather than comparing your group to the other group, right? So it creates an almost like a competitive mindset. When you see one individual of your group succeed, it causes individuals, Wright argues, causes individuals to assume a competitive mindset and compare themselves to other group members in sort of the view that, well, maybe they'll be the next one to make it, right? They want to get ahead of those remaining here. So tokenism then takes the focus away from group differences and turns the focus onto individual differences within the group. And since there's a negative evaluation, right, of the personal treatment here, so in other words, this person has been denied access, they see it as a personal injustice, and so there's an individual response, right? And so Wright thinks that it's individual, non-normative, because the perceivers here, they look at tokenism and they say, well, that's a personal injustice. They are comparing themselves to others in their group. They see themselves as having suffered a personal injustice, and so they're going to take personal measures, individual actions. But again, it's interesting, this notion, though, that tokenism forces a shift in the perspective. Do you look at your own qualities and capacities compared to others in your group, or do you look at the injustice of your group status relative to the dominant group? And Wright argues that tokenism leads to a focus on individual comparisons.